It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It has a stark beauty all its own.
We didn't go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen.
Seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6. Apollo, Saturn launch control, T-minus 3 hours, 4 minutes, 32 seconds and counting. Right on time as far as the astronaut countdown is concerned. The prime crew now departing from their crew quarters. 10, 9, ignition sequence start.
Forward. Forward. 30 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Big shadow. I'm going to step off the limit. It's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Oh, gee, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent? Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes from the lunar surface. Up now, and you can see the stars and stripes from the lunar surface. Push. Mission arm is essay. I'm going to get the pro. 99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. X-Rod. Good over. Okay, you have good thrust. Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Take out your 1,500 feet.
Itself with again with our reaction control nozzles here, with our steam vent lines and a lot of electronics and things around the outside. Now as I lift this part of the structure here, we can see the interior. You can see the three of us in our positions. I'm on the left side, Ed White in the center, and Roger Chaffee on the right. Now down below each of these two outer stations are sleep stations, and then the seats will actually move forward a little bit, and it gives us a lot of standing room down in this area here. Now, the area you're looking at right here is the navigation station. The sextant and telescope are down there, and the computer and the basic guidance and navigation is down in that area. Now, if you can look up into this area, you'll see this is our main instrument panel, and most of the systems and their monitoring instruments are from about this point over. And Roger has those to watch during launch, and this station is our primary watch station during orbit. We normally always have a man in the station. Again, some of the center section here is taken up with guidance and navigation instruments and facilities for Ed. And then the left side is the primary flight station where our attitude gyro is, our 8-ball, and all of the instruments and switches to make our SPS burns.
Well, spacecrafts can be actually flown from all three pilot positions.
Yes, as far as the flight controls themselves are concerned, the stick that flies it, it's movable. We can move it from the left station to the center station to the right station, or even down a lower equipment bay if we need to. And we have two of them on board also. Well, that's a sort of a quick tour, but about as good as this model allows, I guess.
You flew on Mercury, you flew on Gemini, now you're flying on Apollo. Does the law of averages, so far as the possibility of a catastrophic failure, bother you at all, sir?
No, you sort of have to put that out of your mind.
Does the law of averages, so far as the possibility of a catastrophic failure, bother you at all?
There's always a possibility that you can have a catastrophic failure, of course. This can happen on any flight. It can happen on the last one as well as the first one. So you just plan as best you can to take care of all of these eventualities. And you get a well-trained crew and you go fly.
The spacecraft you're going to ride on is to a certain extent, untried. You're taking a shakedown cruise. You approach it with any apprehension as compared to the Gemini, which had been flown before?
No, I don't think so. I think you have to understand the feeling that a pilot has and that a test pilot has. That I look forward a great deal to the first flight. There's a great deal of pride involved in making a first flight. So I think I'm looking forward to the flight with a great deal of anticipation.
Is there anything scary about a first space flight, even though you've flown many hours in conventional aircraft, jet aircraft?
Oh, I don't like to say anything scary about it. There's a lot of unknowns, of course, and a lot of problems that could develop or might develop, and they'll have to be solved. And that's what we're there for. This is our business, to find out if this thing will work for us. I don't think it'll be probably a whole lot worse than a guy that's making a first test flight on a new airplane. Now, I've never done that, so I don't know. I think everybody feels a little apprehensive when they count down. I don't see how you could help but be a little bit excited. But I don't think anybody is, I don't like to use the word scary. I definitely think you're apprehensive and you're considering what's involved there. You're thinking about it. But you know how to handle it and take care of it and do the job.
The flight that you're about to take is another step toward the moon. Could you philosophize on just why you think we should go to the moon?
I think there's so many questions, so many reasons why we should. I guess some of my special reasons I'll give to you. I think one of the ones that a lot of people forget about is the influence that the lunar program has on our raising of our young people in the country. I think our most prime responsibility is to provide a environment so that our children will be able to grow up into creative, useful, and good citizens. And I think that the space program, more so than anything we've done in the past, has given a stimulus to the young people and the very young children even, and in a goal for them and a purpose for them to educate themselves as well as they can to their own capability, and to have, even though they're not going to be obviously all become astronauts, but if they start out with a certain goal when they're young and the goal is properly directed, these young people, I think, have a much more of a chance of becoming useful.
Virgil Gus Grissom was selected as one of the original 7 astronauts. A family man and a veteran of several space flights, he was a national hero and was likely to be the first man to walk on the moon. But Grissom was also an outspoken critic of the space program and was quoted as saying, "Someone's going to get killed."
But Grissom was also an outspoken critic of the space program and was quoted as saying, "Someone's going to get killed."
This is Mike Wallace at the CBS Newsroom in New York. America's first 3 Apollo astronauts were trapped and killed by a flash fire that swept their moonship early tonight during a launch pad test at Cape Kennedy in Florida. Virgil Gus Grissom, 40 years old, one of the original Mercury astronauts, the first American astronaut to go twice into space. Edward White, 36 years old, the first American to walk into space. And rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, 31 years old, training for his first space flight, Apollo 1, scheduled for February 21st. These 3 astronauts were aboard their spaceship 10 minutes from a simulated liftoff at Cape Kennedy when the fire hit at about 6:30 tonight. They were inside their spaceship, pressurized, buttoned up inside their spacesuits when the fire hit.
Unfortunately, Grissom's worst fears were soon realized. On January January 27, 1967, 2 years before the first moon landing. Grissom and his crew boarded the Apollo 1 capsule for a full-scale simulation. The problems began almost immediately. First, the capsule's communication systems failed.
You copy? No, I didn't read you, Chuck, at all. I can't read you, Chuck. You want to try the phone? Hey, how do I get the moon? We can't fly between three buildings. I can't hear a finger's way.
Suddenly, the capsule burst into flames with the astronauts sealed inside. Tragically, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives before ever leaving the launch pad. Gus Grissom's family believes the Apollo 1 fire was no accident.
I think it was intentionally sabotaged by someone. It's been a question in my mind, what was found in the accident investigation and how was that handled? Was the CIA involved or whoever? But it was done intentionally.
Grissom's family doesn't know who was responsible for his death or why it happened. But they say NASA knows the truth.
Gus gave his life for this program, and I feel like that it is up to NASA to come forward and give us a direct answer to what really happened.
Were Gus Grissom and the Apollo 1 astronauts victims of a tragic accident? Or were they intentionally silenced because they knew too much? We may never know. The cause of the fire is still a mystery, and the capsule remains locked away at a military base. But Grissom wasn't the only Apollo critic to meet with a suspicious and untimely death. Thomas Ronald Barron was a safety inspector during Apollo 1's construction. After the fire, Barron testified before Congress that the Apollo program was in such disarray that the United States would never make it to the moon. He claimed his opinions made him a target.
Has there been any pressure on you by NASA? Nothing. We were, my wife and I were somewhat harassed at home when the first thing broke some time back, but it's going away now.
As part of his testimony, Barron submitted a 500-page report detailing his findings.
There was real fear that the program could be stopped dead in its tracks.
Then exactly 1 week after he testified, Barron's car was struck by a train.
Then exactly 1 week after he testified, Barron's car was struck by a train.
Barron, his wife, and stepdaughter were killed instantly.
I believe that Thomas Ronald Barron was murdered because he had the truth to tell about the Apollo project.
Barron's report mysteriously disappeared, and to this day, it has never been found.
Barron's report mysteriously disappeared, and to this day, it has never been found.
I interviewed the widow and the son of the man who is going to be the first man to walk on the moon. He was beloved by the public and the media. And according to his widow, who I interviewed for 4 hours, and according to his son, who's a 747 pilot, who I interviewed for 3 hours, he was murdered by the CIA because he would not cooperate with fraud in the Apollo program.
That's correct. Can we slow that story down for people that don't know about Grisham? Can you explain what was supposed to happen? Because a lot of people that were supposed to go to the moon ended up dead in very mysterious circumstances. People that were supposed to testify about the death ended up dead in mysterious circumstances. So let's slow that down for my listeners in case this is the first time they've ever even considered that the moon landing didn't happen.
Yeah, so basically, Gus Grissom was the most beloved astronaut because he had an accident where his space capsule sank to the bottom of the ocean, and he confessed at the press conference he had all of these rolls of nickels in his pocket to give to his son, to give to his schoolmates, to say this nickel has been in outer space. And when he started sinking with that extra weight, he said, maybe that wasn't such a brilliant idea. The media laughed, and then someone asked him, were you afraid? And he said, of course I was afraid. And everyone said, this guy's real. They said he's going to be the first man to walk on the moon. He was preparing congressional reports and giving them to senators that were taken from his home by the CIA before they even informed his widow that he was dead.
And giving them to senators that were taken from his home by the CIA before they even informed his widow that he was dead.
Now, this is the command module. This is where the astronauts were today. This is the service module. This is where the fuels and the electrical systems are housed, are engineered in here. The spacecraft today was in a fully pressurized system. This means 100% oxygen. The speculation tonight, and again, I must say it's speculation only, is that there was some electrical problem. Possibly with some plastic wires or something of that nature, but this is speculation purely. That an electrical short circuit occurred, and of course, I think everyone knows what would happen in the event of an electrical short circuit in a 100% oxygen state. That's our speculation as of the moment, Mike.
The three men were to have gone up on February 21st for a 14-day...
Upwards, that's right, Mike, upwards of 2 weeks. Our guess was that it was going to be a 10 or an 11-day flight, but they were scheduled for a 2-week flight.
And the latest news from Cape Kennedy and from the Houston Manned Spacecraft Center is that the flight of Apollo 1 has now been postponed indefinitely.
It was tragedy. You know, they'd never had as Mike Wallace said, never been a fatality in the space program. Everyone knew it was risky, but, you know, there's theory and there's reality. And I think the loss of these three astronauts was a major blow. It was certainly shocking to NASA, and I think to the public at large. I mean, think about it. They were on the launch pad. They didn't even have the rocket fueled. They weren't going anywhere.
I mean, think about it. They were on the launch pad. They didn't even have the rocket fueled. They weren't going anywhere. They didn't even have the rocket fueled. They weren't going anywhere.
They didn't even have the rocket fueled. They weren't going anywhere. And yet they had a disaster that claimed their lives. And it really sent shockwaves, I think, through NASA and also through the nation. As you can tell by that special report, this was something that, you know, people were riveted to their television sets to find out what had happened, what might have gone wrong, and what might it do to the race to the moon.
And there were several flaws that were realized in the aftermath of the fire. And if that fire hadn't happened, do you think that NASA would ever have made it to the moon?
You know, that's one of those questions you can't answer. Hindsight's 20/20. They did in the investigation find numerous problems with the Apollo command module.
On January 26, 1967, he came home and told his wife the following, who told me, "Hon, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad today. I've never seen the CIA here in 3 years. Why did they show up today to inspect the equipment? The next day he's dead from faulty equipment. Days earlier, he held a press conference without permission. And he took a bunch of reporters up to the top of the rocket where he affixed a lemon the size of a grapefruit to the top of the rocket, calling it publicly a piece of junk. In fact, seconds before he burned alive, murdered by the CIA, his widow's opinion, not mine, they couldn't even get a wired intercom to work between two buildings. He says, how are we going to go to the moon? He says they're not fixing anything because they knew they were going to fake it and hadn't told the astronauts yet. It was faked a year later. So here's the point. Our country was formed, right, not by the Constitution, by the Declaration of Independence against the tyranny of King George, right? Because he was an obstacle to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. What's the first one? Life. The federal government is murdering their own people. Does anybody care? It'd be one thing if they faked the moon landing and didn't kill anybody. But that's not the case. You see, they're so afraid for the truth about this to come out. I showed two NBC News directors the video that you can see on the homepage of Sabrel.com of them faking being halfway to the moon with a 1-foot model, the thing that convinced me and my critics they're faking part of the mission, which they would never have to do if they really went. One of them refused to broadcast it. He said this will cause a civil war. I'm not going to go down in history as the man that caused a civil war. And the other one 10 years later, agreed to broadcast it, flew me to New York, put me up in the Waldorf Astoria. They said, we're going to break the story nationwide. They get a call from the federal government telling them, don't embarrass us. Cancel the broadcast, and they did. All these podcasters who claim that they're anti-deep state are defending the moon landing. They're defending people who are accessory to murders. Right? A great broadcaster, Glenn Beck, who's sincere but sincerely wrong, has me on for 15 minutes in audio and has on Charles Duke an hour on in video. An Apollo astronaut who has the audacity to claim to be a Christian, right? Lying, assuming that people are going to believe him if he calls himself a Christian. When because of his participation in the moon landing fraud, many people were killed. My eyewitness was Cyrus Eugene Akers. He was the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base. And as he was dying, fearing God's judgment, and as we know, if we renounce our sin and confess, we're forgiven. The first thing out of his mouth, chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base, he says, I'm a murderer. I killed somebody. His son says who? He says a co-worker at Cannon Air Force Base. His son brings in the military police to investigate, to give the family closure. Maybe they just dumped his body somewhere, said he disappeared. Then they asked him why. Why did you kill him? He said to cover up landing fraud. We both eyewitnessed it in 1968. At Cannon Air Force Base, President Johnson was there the first of 3 days of filming. My friend thought it was morally wrong. I killed him to keep it a secret.
Bill Casing was an analyst and engineer at Rocketdyne, the company that designed the Apollo rockets.
There were many problems that evolved during the 60s that led people to believe that we're never going to make it to the moon.
Three decades ago, when the world watched Apollo's lunar landings, Bill Casing was watching too. But what he saw on television, combined with his experiences at Rocketdyne, made him a skeptic.
The whole thing then seemed phony to me. I think it was an intuitive feeling that what was being shown was not real.
As he studied the footage more closely, he was shocked to find several inconsistencies. Casing observed that despite the clarity of deep space, the stars were missing from the black lunar sky. He saw the American flag waving, even though there is no air on the moon. And he discovered that there was no blast crater beneath the lunar lander, where its powerful rocket engine had fired. This evidence convinced Casing that we never sent a man to the moon. But NASA dismisses these charges.
There are always going to be people who believe some outlandish theories, and the notion that we somehow were able to fake the lunar missions is pretty outlandish.
As outlandish as it might seem, it has been estimated that as many as 20% of Americans believe we never went to the moon. But how could anyone think that one of the greatest moments in human history is a hoax? Is it really possible that NASA deceived the world? According to a former astronaut, it's entirely possible.
Regarding the Apollo mission, I can't say 100% for sure whether these men walked on the moon.
Brian O'Leary was a NASA astronaut in the 1960s and served as a science advisor during the Apollo moon missions.
It's possible that NASA could have covered it up just in order to cut corners and to be the first to allegedly go to the moon.
America and the Soviets were locked in a struggle for world domination.
People assumed that the nation that won the space race would win the Cold War. We defined that as being first to the moon.
The nation that won the space race would win the Cold War. We defined that as being first to the moon.
It was a time of more or less national hysteria.
On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets terrified America when they sent Sputnik, the world's first satellite, into orbit.
The New York Times had to publish an article explaining to Americans that it did not carry nuclear bombs that could be dropped on the city from that altitude.
The American public's fear of nuclear annihilation intensified as Russia took the lead in the space race.
House Speaker announced in Congress that we may be headed for extinction.
Many feared that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was to put a missile base on the moon. Meanwhile, America's space program was having difficulty even getting off the ground.
Meanwhile, America's space program was having difficulty even getting off the ground.
The chances of getting to the moon and returning safely to Earth were something like 0.0017%. In other words, virtually an impossibility.
What actually happened in my mind is that during the 60s, they said, if you can't make it, fake it.
But if the Apollo missions were fake, how was this monumental hoax accomplished? According to Casing, the launch of Apollo's Saturn V rocket was real. It just never sent astronauts to the moon.
The astronauts were launched with the Saturn V. Then, in order to account for their disappearance, they simply orbited the Earth for 8 days. And in the interim, they showed these fake pictures of the astronauts on the moon. But on the 8th day, the command capsule separated from the vehicle and descended to Earth, as of course was shown in films.
But with NASA's $40 billion budget, Casing believes they had the resources to pull off a hoax if they couldn't make it to the moon.
The reason I believe that NASA and the government faked the moon landing.
Heard the story, like someone who went up to Buzz Aldrin with a Bible and said, put your hand in the Bible. Did you guys go to the moon? And instead of getting an answer, he got punched in the face, which I feel like if I went to the moon, I would just be like, yes, we did, and put my hand in the Bible. I don't think I would get violent. So what is your side of the story?
Well, we had first produced A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. This is $1 million film financed by a board member of an aerospace company who builds rockets for NASA, who knows that the moon landings are fake, thought it was his patriotic duty to expose it. He gave us $1 million to produce A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. I grew up as the biggest fan of the moon landings. I mean, a fanboy. I had a shrine of Apollo 11 pictures in my bedroom. I was 4 years old at the time, and they followed me wherever I went. But I had an open mind. And I met a guy who worked at NASA who said it never happened. I'm thinking, oh, I never thought about that. And when I became a filmmaker whose job is to make fake scenes look real, I'm like, these are definitely shot with electrical lighting. It's pretty easy to prove. Halfway into the film, you see, the way I looked at it, Candace, is if they faked the moon landing, they're more likely to have made a mistake the first time they faked it. So I asked NASA, as a journalist, I'm doing a documentary about the moon landings, which was true, and send me everything you got just from the first moon mission, figuring if they made a mistake, they're more likely to have made it the first time because they had never faked it before. So I meticulously went through everything, and there's very little footage. There's only like 20 pictures of an astronaut on the moon in the first mission, and you get the same footage over and over again. Well, my source at NASA believes a whistleblower sent me a tape. I pop it in, it says do not show to the public on the screen. And they're faking being halfway to the moon, dated 2 days into the flight. All the astronauts are on camera, and they're using a 1-foot model to make it look like the Earth's floating in space, and they're looking back at it from a distance. They never left Earth orbit. And what a surprise, 55 years later, they still cannot leave Earth orbit.
And what a surprise, 55 years later, they still cannot leave Earth orbit.
It was technically impossible to do it. And they simply had to come up with some sort of alternative that they felt the public would believe.
Casing theorizes that the lunar landings were actually filmed in Nevada's high desert, at the top secret military base known as Area 51.
Area 51 is one of the most heavily guarded facilities in the United States. If you went in, and tried to get some information, you could be shot and killed without any warning.
Russian spy satellite photos of Area 51 reveal not only a series of hangars that resemble movie sound stages, but also barren moon-like areas which coincidentally are covered with craters. Compare this photo of a lunar crater allegedly taken from the moon's orbit by Apollo 10 with this satellite photo of a crater at Area 51. Even astronauts acknowledge the similarity of the terrain.
It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States.
The noise level of a rocket engine is up into the 140, 150 decibel range. In other words, enormously loud. How would it be possible to hear astronauts' voices against the background of a running rocket engine?
Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
Is this evidence that the footage is actually fake? A sequence shot in a controlled environment here on Earth? Just months before this historic landing, a prototype LEM was flight tested at Ellington Air Force Base. While NASA cameras record the test flight, Neil Armstrong struggles to control the unwieldy craft. Then, at approximately 300 feet, the lander flies wildly out of control. At the last second, Armstrong ejects. And floats to safety. If the lander was so unstable and difficult to fly in the controlled environment of Earth, then how could the LEM land 6 times flawlessly in the alien environment of the moon?
The LEM had a single engine mounted dead center, and then they had little push jets, thruster jets, a couple of them up on top. This was supposed to control their attitude as they came down. Well, I'll tell you a secret. The instant you moved your tail in that cabin an inch, you would change the load pattern. It would begin to tilt, and it would start that thing spinning.
Call Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
Okay, so what we're seeing here on the right-hand side is allegedly the Earth floating in space. But in fact, that is a circular window of the spacecraft. You can kind of see the thickness there at the bottom. And they moved the camera at the back of the spacecraft and they turned out all the lights. And you're seeing part of the Earth outside of a circular window. But it looks like the Earth floating in space from a distance.
And you're seeing part of the Earth outside of a circular window, but it looks like the Earth floating in space from a distance.
Never left Earth orbit, because there it is right out the window, and they're faking being halfway to the moon. They allegedly have the lens at the window's glass to shoot the tiny Earth far away. But when we show the final clip, you'll see that the camera's at the back of the spacecraft. All these segments we got were unedited. They only showed about 10 seconds of this to the public. That's why it says do not show to the public at the beginning of this unedited reel. Now what you just heard, and you can play it again, is the talk, is because they're in Earth orbit, only a couple of hundred miles of the Earth, they would have an instantaneous conversation with NASA. Like, I might say, hello, how are you? They would say, I'm doing fine. How are you? I'm doing okay. But they're supposed to be halfway to the moon or 136,000 miles away. So what they did is they faked a 4-second radio delay as if it took 2 seconds to go out to them and 2 seconds for the radio transmission to come back. So what you hear, if you want to play it again, is you hear NASA saying the TV picture looks great.
Call Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
There are 4 seconds of dead air. And now you'll hear the CIA prompting them to speak after the 4 seconds. we actually have a third track of hidden audio of the CIA telling them not to speak until 4 seconds go by to create this fake radio delay. Now, if you go to the next clip, this is where Neil Armstrong lied.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
And so go ahead and freeze it there. So he just lied. This is the part that's in all the NASA reels. He claims he's halfway to the moon, but what you're seeing is really a circular window of the spacecraft with the camera back. If that were really the Earth floating in space, the lens would have to be at the glass, right? But it's actually at the back of the spacecraft. All the lights are off, and you're seeing a circular window in the foreground, outside of which is completely filled with the Earth and low Earth orbit. They even insert a little crescent piece of material into the window to make it look like the Terminator line between night and day. Now, if you go to 3913, and of course all this is viewable on the homepage of Sabrell.com, you'll see the outtake. Go ahead and play this, and this is the part that really gets you. You can dim down the audio if you want. So basically, this is the outtake. We have the unedited reel. That's why it said don't show to the public at the beginning. And here they are removing part of the transparency in front of the window and part of the special effect. That's a work light inside of the spacecraft. And then the lights come up and you see that they're in Earth orbit all the time. And we're using a 1-foot model of the Earth using the circular window to fake being halfway to the moon. So you see, that was the circular window the entire time. So you can play that again. It's really remarkable.
The surface appears to be very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder.
To have a powerful rocket engine blast the surface of the moon, blasting away all of the dust, and then find footprints surrounding the lunar lander, that to me would be an impossibility. Blast the surface of the moon, blasting away all of the dust, and then find footprints surrounding the lunar lander, that to me would be an impossibility.
Photo after photo reveals that the lunar surface surrounding the LEM is covered with footprints. But Casing says there's something even more difficult to explain.
The fact that there's no blast crater under the LEM is one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence that I find supporting the hoax.
In fact, no sign of a blast crater is visible for any of the 6 lunar landings. But LEM specialist Paul Fiel says he can explain why the lunar module left no crater when landing on the moon.
The amount of thrust that you need coming out of the bottom of the descent engine is about 1,500, 2,000 pounds of thrust. And all that does is just push dust away. There's no burning or anything like that.
Yet NASA's own scientific illustrations clearly depict a blast crater.
Then there's one other point. If they had truly landed on the moon, this dust would have then descended on the lunar lander, on the foot pads, and we find not a trace of dust on the foot pads. When I discovered that alone, I said, no way am I looking at a lunar lander that landed on the moon.
They didn't go. I was the biggest fan of it, and if I can admit, reluctantly, that they faked it, and people don't realize what this means. It's so profound. I mean, imagine this, Candace. Imagine they really did go to the moon and come back. Boy, that was a close one. Or they lied about it to the whole world. They embezzled an equivalent of $250 billion. They printed it on coins, on stamps, in the encyclopedia, and gave them medals of honor for being such good liars. And according to people I've interviewed, relatives of dead astronauts who were murdered by the CIA. Their opinion, not mine. If that's true, which sadly it is, that is so much more profound than if they actually went. So what we have is one of the greatest events in human history is the faking of the moon landing by the most powerful nation on Earth. And people don't realize how easy it was to fake. It's like whoever killed JFK, he's still dead. It's a tragedy. Whoever did 9/11, they're still dead. It's a tragedy. You can change the hats on who did it and why. This is different. This is a positive lie. you see, Cannon Air Force Base, and confessed so as he was dying.
Wow. You know, there was another piece of this. There was a guy, and I'm not sure if he was due to give congressional testimony, who got into a bizarre car accident. His entire family got killed, and I'm just sort of blanking on who that was and how it related to the moon landings.
Ronald Barron was inspector at Rocketdyne, I believe, and because he did such a good job pointing out this equipment is a piece of junk, they fired him. Congress said that's the guy we want to report on Apollo. When the murders happened, they wanted him all the more, and they basically killed him on the way to report for the second time for Congress that the moon mission is 10 years or more away from going to the moon. I mean, they can't go to the moon today. They can only go 1,000th the distance. So yes, they faked it. And here's what people need to have an epiphany.
And he was killed in a car accident, right? Him and his wife,
well,
is that correct?
It appears that he was killed in a car accident. What they probably did is killed him elsewhere. They put his car on a train track to destroy the forensic evidence because they didn't have DNA capability at the time.
What about the still photography? Some say the design of the bulky spacesuits would have made it extremely difficult for the astronauts to operate their chest-mounted cameras. The man who designed these cameras is Jan Lundberg.
Once on the moon, on the lunar surface, in the dress, in the life support system, you couldn't see the camera. They couldn't bend their head that far down. They had no viewfinder. They had to aim by moving their body.
If the cameras were so difficult to manipulate, how were thousands of photos taken with crystal clarity and precise framing?
The pictures that we see that allegedly were taken on the moon are absolutely perfect.
But with closer examination, Casing says flaws begin to emerge.
Unfortunately, errors were made which are now being discovered.
Conspiracy theorists point out that lighting is a major flaw in the lunar photos. Case in point, on the moon, the astronauts' only source of light was the sun.
They had no extra lighting, no flashes or things like that.
Yet in this photograph from Apollo 14, the shadows are cast in different directions, suggesting multiple light sources.
Suggesting multiple light sources. Suggesting multiple light sources.
The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadows.
And in this photo from Apollo 17, again the shadows are pointing in different directions.
Outside in sunlight, shadows always run parallel with one another, so the shadows will never intersect.
Conspiracy theorists say it's not just the shadows that indicate the use of additional lights, but what has been photographed in the shadows. For example, here's an astronaut who descends into a huge shadow cast by the lunar module. Yet his entire body is still visible. How is it that he is not shrouded in darkness? Here's the same maneuver from another Apollo mission. Again, the astronaut is brightly lit in what is obviously dark shadow. And in this picture, the sun is directly behind the astronaut. His figure should be a silhouette. Yet even the smallest characteristics of his suit are recognizable.
It seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why?
Can't explain that. That escapes me. Why?
People need to understand this. According to Bobby Kennedy Jr., who has more access to the JFK files than Oliver Stone does, his opinion, which is he's the expert, not me, so it's my opinion, his uncle, President Kennedy, was absolutely 100% killed by the CIA. I guess that's selection interference, isn't it? And then Robert McNamara, Defense Secretary during the Vietnam War, said, look, the public was against entering the war. We said we need some sort of Pearl Harbor type of thing. Well, the day before Pearl Harbor, 90% of Americans were against World War II. The day after, they wanted to get even. So they created a fake attack by the North Vietnamese against an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress passed a law, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. He said on his deathbed, it never happened, we made it up. Congress passed a law. Shouldn't the CIA get a reprimand, if not be completely shut down forever? Right? So my point is, the federal government is willing to kill their own president. They're willing to start a war that needlessly killed 58,220 of their own people. So I don't think they're going to have a problem faking a video image on the moon. You see? And if you want to show people, I know I sent to Mark this still picture. You can prove. Now, first be proved with logic. You can't have 1,000 times greater space traveling technology in 1969 than you can today. There you go. It's over. They didn't go. If you need more proof than that, bring up the picture. A still picture. I'm a filmmaker. Like I said, my job is to make fake scenes look real. And if we show this picture, you'll see that in sunlight, shadows are parallel. Go outside on a sunny day, 2 trees, 2 telephone poles, 2 people standing in your front yard or parking lot at lunch. And you'll see it's impossible mathematically for the shadows to intersect. You see that on the left-hand side? It's impossible. Then here's a picture they claim is on the moon, that the astronaut shadow is going at 12 o'clock and a shadow from a rock is going at 9 o'clock. Now, that's a 90-degree difference from objects 5 feet apart. This is all the proof that you need that the moon missions were taken on Earth, because it's supposed to be 20 times brighter than a desert on Earth because there's no atmosphere, so you don't need light. That's proof that light is really close, and it's an electrical light. That means they didn't go.
Habitation on the moon. We can visit other people with their habitation. We can keep track. If there's something very important to be developed from the moon, I'm not sure what it is right now, and I sure think we should identify what it is for America to make such gross expenditures again for human habitation on the moon. We can help. We can join with. Together, we can explore the moon and develop the moon. We should go boldly where man has not gone before. Fly by the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once in 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there? Who put that there? Well, the universe put it there. If you choose, God put it there.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen, it's nice to know why it didn't happen. So in the future, if we want to keep doing something, we need to know why something stopped in the past that we wanted to keep it going. But I think I know. Because we didn't.
But I think I know. Because we didn't. Because we didn't. Because we did.